going to provide some theoretical framework in which it can help us to understand these type of innovations. Okay, the first areas of innovation I want to introduce is the areas in fighting traffic congestion. Right. So those are the pictures that I downloaded from the website. This is in Beijing, where I studied and lived for about 8 years. And when I left Beijing in 1993, the situation was not like this. But now, actually, getting worse, and we expect probably 5 to 10 years is going to even get worse than today, right? That's Moscow, and for those of you who leave Moscow before about it, you also become nice that traffic congestion also becomes a problem. And this is Delhi, New Delhi in India, and there's a significant problem also. And if you look at the nature of the problems and where it can happen, it's not necessarily just a phenomenon associated with developing countries. Also, cities, major cities in developed countries also suffer from the same problem, which is the failures, right? So what are the policy tools or sort of policy instruments used in Singapore? If I just tell you that Singapore has more or less escaped from the traffic congestion problems that as we see here, that you probably wouldn't believe me, because it's there's more than 5 million population in such a densely populated place. How can Singapore escape from this situation as we heard in many places here? So I'm going to give you this is the real-time camera, traffic camera that installed in different parts of Singapore. So basically, we can see in real time what is now in kind of traffic situation in sort of the main road in Singapore. So we can take a look. These are different roads. First. So this is CTE. Take a look at it. So, and show you the CCP. This is a 1303. This is exactly because Singapore is 2 hours ahead of Astana. So this is precisely today's the kind of traffic situation as we speak, right? And let me see what happened to this PIE is actually, I use PIE every day. This is considered to be most congested, right? And you kind of take a look at what is the situation in PIE. These are different components. Okay, so what is this is the situation as we speak, right? So in general, I think that you would agree with me that in general, you do not in Singapore in general, you do not see the situations as those that are confronting many cities in both developing countries and developed countries. So that's so part of the discussion today we're going to have is going to focusing on what are the areas of policy that adopted in Singapore, and also what are the various iterations of policies in this area in fighting traffic congestion. That's one area I'm going to focus on today's discussion. The second area, which I'm not going to get into detail, but at the end I'm going to show you the findings in areas of healthcare. Right? So to look at the healthcare in Singapore, this is compare Singapore with some of the developing and developed countries in Asia, as well as comparing Singapore with some of the countries in the West, like the United Kingdom and the United States. Right? So in general, if you look at the performance of healthcare system measured by infant mortality rate and the life expectancies and so forth, you find that Singapore perform roughly at the same level as the other developed nations. If you look at compared with like infant mortality, this is the figure for Singapore. If you compare with Canada, United Kingdom, United States, and Japan, these are kind of the same level of performance in general, but of course much better than some of the developing countries such as China and India. And also if you look at life expectancy, also that the performance is very similar in Singapore compared to the developed countries as well. What's the significant difference here between Singapore and other countries is the total, the healthcare expenditures. Right? If you look at the healthcare expenditure in Singapore, this is about, compared to GDP, 2010 about 4.5% of overall GDP, right? This compared to roughly 18% in the US. In the US, 18% of GDP is actually spent on healthcare, right? And if you look at the United Kingdom, about 10%, Canada about 11%, all much higher than the expenditures compared to Singapore. Right? So the story here is that Singapore has been able to deliver in general the same level of quality of care with significantly less cost. That's basically so it looks like much cost effective compared to a lot of the developing nations. So this is another kind of area we would like to also discuss today's talk. Okay, I want to, like I mentioned before, I want to present a theoretical framework in which we can link those experiences to. And in fact, when we look at those innovations in the different areas, some countries, let's say Kazakhstan in Astana today, you may not have significant problem yet on the traffic congestion, right? But the framework we're going to discuss today might be relevant for you to look at the policy problems in other areas that are of particular concern today for Kazakhstan and Astana. So I think it's useful to look at it so I'm going to use two starting points. One starting point is market failure. For those of us who study public policy, and this is an essential concept in public policy. It's called market failure. Right? Market failure is that the so-called free market sometimes will run into problems without government policy, without government intervention. Right? So including public goods, externality, national monopoly, information asymmetry, these are kind of the areas where the market is fair. Right? Because of the market failure, then if you study economics and public policy, then there are a range of government intervention can be used to correct the market failure. Right? The range of the government intervention including regulation, taxation, providing subsidy, establish state-owned enterprise, provide goods directly to people in need, right? Nationalize the industry, and stockpiling. Right? They basically provide some sort of reserve to safeguard the potential risk in the future, right? And also civil and criminal law. These are kind of various government intervention can be used to correct the market failure. But the problem is that once you use those literature theory, it basically suggests that government actually fail more often, right, than they are able to solve those problems. That's a much of public choice theory formula. So why is that? Why is the case? Well, because of the rent EP. Government help the business looking for a normal return, and regulatory capture. Government regulated capture by industry. Inefficiencies in operation, right? Implementation problem, agency losses. So if you study public choice theory, basically say there's problem with government intervention because of the government. Okay, so now I'm going to use another starting point, right? Another starting point is the government failures. Now, okay, let's just start with government failures. So we know that the government is not efficient. Government, the regulator from the government captured by industry's interests and so forth, right? So because of government failure. So how do you deal with government failure? Well, you use a market mechanism. In many countries, market-oriented reform is the key, right? You contract out, you privatize, right? You engage private sector, and you impose user charge. These are kind of various market-oriented reform trying to correct the government failures. But are they working? Are they working well when you use the set of market mechanism? They work in some areas, but not in other areas. Also, sometimes that even for the same areas, they work in certain countries, but not in others here. So you have to look at the issue of government failures that we started with. So this is kind of welfare economics discussion. So the result is that we find ourselves in this vicious circle, right? So it doesn't matter where you start. You start with market failures, okay? The market failure is a big concern. Let's use government intervention to correct them. But once you use them, you find that they are subject to a variety of government failures, right? And what do? Well, you start to think about how to come up with reform based on market mechanism. But once you do that, you're subject to market failure. This is a vicious circle here, right? Never really a good solution. So what is if you have a vicious circle like this, in reality, how do government deal with policy problems? Well, there's several responses. One is that you will see that the reform package has been implemented like a pendulum shift. For the past 5 years, you're focusing on market-oriented reform. And you find that you have a problem, and then you make another shift to the other extreme. Then you find there's a lot of problem with government intervention. You shift that back and forth. Right? So that's you look at from the long-term perspective. When you look at the pattern of the public sector reform, you tend to see this pendulum shift, right? And the other responses from the government is basically at any given time you have to pick. Market solutions got a lot of problems. Government intervention also got a lot of problems. Where you just pick the one that you feel it costs the least time or less time than others. Right? So both of them not perfect. I try to find out the one that will perform a little better. That's kind of one kind of strategy that you use. But both are problematic. Right? So today we're going to use a different framework to capture the essence of the problems that embedded in the vicious the cycle here between the market failure and the government failure. This is a concept that I developed called the duality between market imperfection and the government imperfection. Right? Notice that we revise the concept from the market failure to market perfection, because we believe that there are a lot more areas where government intervene the market and intervene the societies that are much beyond the presence of a market failure. There's a lot of instances the government intervenes which have nothing to do with market failure. Right? So we broaden the concept to market imperfection. Right? We also broaden the concept of the government failures to government imperfections. Right? So here, if you look at the range of market imperfection we identified, the first type of imperfection is a loss of economic efficiency due to market failure. So in a way, market failure is part of it. But market imperfection is more than that. It's including lack of mechanism to pursue goals other than efficiency. Basically, we say that if you just rely on the market, you will not be able to count on that market mechanism to pursue goals other than efficiency. If you want equity, if you want fairness and all other environmental protection, well, you cannot count on the market to do that job for you. That's basically we say that's a problem with market. And the market power, there's sometimes that not necessarily that you have a perfect competition. You know, perfect competition is the condition for market to work well. But a lot of circumstances, we don't have a perfect competition. We have limited buyer and seller. And those are instances where the buyer and seller can exercise the market powers. Right? So, and that is also not a situation that described in the market failure literature. Much broader than that. Transaction cost. If you want a market to work well, you have to deal with the high-level transaction cost. And this is also not included in the literature on public failure. Then also public distrust towards profit motive in essential service. Because when you privatize something like a water, when you privatize something like a healthcare or education, then the public have a strong opinions against them. This is something that the government can do little about it. The private sector can do little about it. Right? That is essentially, we consider this as a market imperfections. And also bonded rationality, right? Much of the efficiency of the market mechanism depends on rational choices made by various participants in the market. But that assumption may not necessarily be held a lot of circumstances. So that's another problem. Right? So that's a range of a market imperfection. When we look at a market imperfection, we're saying that these imperfections are inherent natures, inherent characteristics of market. It doesn't matter where the market are. The market can be in developing country or developed country. But as long as their market mechanism, they suffer from the same set of market imperfections. Right? So this is not phenomenon for the market in transition. This is not phenomenon for market in developing countries. This is the phenomenon for market regardless of where they operate. Right? So that's what we call it inherent. And also you've got this inherent government imperfection. One is a limited capacity to access necessary information. If government decides to do anything, like tax, okay, you need to decide tax rate. But do you have enough information really to get the optimal tax that is both promote efficiency and equity? Can you actually keep up with that information? Right? Because today you may have a good balance, but tomorrow situation change. Can you keep up? Right? So the problem here is that typically it doesn't matter which government, it doesn't matter which country that you find that. Government always have a limited capacity to get the necessary information. Right? So that's a significant shortcoming. Principal agent problem, right? Because if the government doing something, then there are additional interests involved other than the public interest. Public sector organizations looking for expanding their budget, or the individual looking for their promotion, individual interest. So these are developing principal agent problem, which is quite pervasive in the government, in youth government intervention. But power of organized interest. When government decides to do something, actually that decision is basically influenced heavily by whether or not certain interests are organized. If the interests are organized, then government probably government decision will be affected more. If the interest is not organized, like the general public, there are certain policies that will affect everyone in the country. But because it's difficult really to organize the interest, right? Organize everyone, and that that consequences, that impact may have a limited influences on government decisions compared to areas that government can, or area where the interest can be organized effectively. Yeah. You got also strategic response from individuals and businesses. You have administrative costs involved. When government doing something, additional administrative costs, like a lack of competition. If you provide license, you are the only one provide licenses, no competition. Right? This is very different from private sector operation. Financial sustainability. It's fine for you to decide to provide subsidy in certain areas, but can you sustain that obligation? Today, that you find yourself that in a healthy situation in the financial revenue, but would that be the same situation tomorrow? Can you sustain it? Right? So that's a big problem here. If the private sector decides to do something, we don't have to think about sustainability, because if they cannot sustain, they go out of business. New business will come. So, but the public sector, if public sector decides to do something, such as subsidy, we worry more about whether or not it's sustainable, right? So it's an inherent shortcomings if you decide to use public sector, the instrument, right, government innovation. Right, so this duality is that it doesn't matter what you decide to do. You decide to use market mechanism, then you have to think about this market imperfection. If you decided to engage government innovation, then you have to deal with the set government imperfection. These are just the two sides of the same coin. They forever exist. Right? So the problem with a lot of the reform efforts is that at a particular time, we seem to pay a lot of attention on one kind of imperfection, and then neglect the other type of imperfection, right? Because when we start thinking about the market-oriented reform, then very much of our emphasis are focusing on how do you deal with the market imperfection. We tend to forget that whenever you use market-oriented reform, you are going to encounter the problem of market imperfections. So that's the duality, right? Ronald Coase made this statement. I think this is quite telling in the story of this duality between the market imperfection and the government imperfection. He said, until we realize that we are choosing between social arrangements that are more or less all failures, we are not likely to make much headway. They're more likely, or with some kind of element of failure. They're not perfect. At the same time, here, our emphasis here is like we try to look at policy interventions that can deal with the problem, deal with imperfection, right? But we can actually think about proactive. We say, well, instead of just focusing on correcting the problem, we should be also looking at how do we take advantage of the strengths of both market and the government, right? What are the strengths of the market relative to government, right? The strength of the market is that efficiency gained from the competition, freedom of individual choices, fast response to changes in the environment, right? Because any changes then will be reflected in demand and supply, the prices will immediately capture that characteristic change. Financial stability and service provision. But these are kind of the strengths of the market in relative to the government. But the government also have their own strengths relative to the market, right? So this is maximizing over larger pool of resources, right? In national government, think about the pool of resources available for the national government for the purpose of optimizing, right? Quick and sure changes due to use of coercive power. If government decide to do something, then you can see a fast, a swift outcome. Like I remember example during the SARS, in many places. You remember in 2003, there, the SARS is a big problem in part of Asia, right? So here, if you rely on market mechanism, it may not necessarily work very effectively by to kind of stop the flow of the travel from one place to another. But if a government decides to do something, if government would put an end on it, government can rely on coercive power. They can put people into jail. Right? This is something the market mechanisms will not be able to call upon. So this is something that's quite important as well. Pursue the social goal other than efficiency. If government decided to pursue other goal, right, goal other than efficiency, they can do that. An ability to alter incentive structure. Right? Market offers certain incentive structure. But if you allow the market to operate, then that's the only incentive structure going to be there, dominate for a long time. Only market or government can change it, right? Accountability to public majority in some cases. Right? So these are kind of various strengths of the government and the market. So the policy innovation concept I'm going to discuss today have two characteristics. One characteristic is that those innovations help us to deal with the two imperfections at the same time. Not at a different time, or not like you at a particular time you worry about one imperfection, then 5 years later you worry about the other imperfection. But at the same time, how do you deal with two imperfections, like given that they are inherent at the same time? So that's basically that, innovation here dealing with imperfection and the market imperfection and government imperfection. But at the same time, can those innovations, which I later on will use the concept of policy mix, can take advantage of the strengths of both market and the government? So that's what I call policy innovation. So they deal with the two imperfections at the same time, and also at the same time, they can take advantage of the market and the government at the same time. So I'm going to focus on the land transfer policy. Later on, we're going to introduce the policy mix for healthcare. And right now, we are working on a book, actually, a couple of my colleagues and myself. We're working on a book looking at the policy innovations in the different areas, such as housing, education, basically applying the same framework to other policy sectors. Right? But today, for the discussion today, we're going to focusing on very much on land transport policy. Okay, so if you look at the land transport, I show you those pictures from different places, from Beijing, from New Delhi, Los Angeles, and so forth. Right. So if you look at what are the key issues in the land transport with regard to traffic congestion, right? We can look at, for example, from the perspective of market imperfection. This is actually, if you read the textbook in economics, this is a classical example of externality. If you study economics, you know that the externality refers to the additional cost or benefits that derive from your action, which you do not take into consideration. Right? So traffic congestion is one example, where when you drive a car in a congested road, you have certain private costs involved. Right? You have to use gasoline, you have to buy a car with certain private costs. But your action also have additional costs imposed on other people, other travelers, right? Or maybe there's a very high level of pollution will be also a cost, additional cost as well. So the externality is that in a situation where the social cost actually is higher than the private cost, that's a problem. So when the private cost is lower than the social cost, then people do not take full consideration of their action, right? The cost of their action. So as a result, a lot of people drive a car, a lot of people own a car, right? But if you can impose the social cost on individuals, get people to really recognize the true cost of their action, then perhaps they will change their behavior. So that's a loss of efficiency. You know, if you study economics, then what are the solutions? The solution is quite straightforward from economics textbook. The economists would say, well, just increase the cost, right? So the cost of ownership is equal to price plus additional charge reflecting externality. Make people pay more, right? Isn't that quite straightforward? If you say that private cost is too low, well, make the private cost really reflect the social cost. More charges, right? So that's in a way, from the perspective of prescribing a policy solution, this is very straightforward. There's no disagreement. But the problem is that if you work for the Ministry of Transport, and your task is to decide the right amount of the additional charge, how do we know the right amount? Should we charge double the cost, or triple the cost, or 50% of the cost, 1/3 of the cost? How do we know that? Well, if you don't know that, then how do you proceed? It's a good idea in theory, but if you have to implement, how do you proceed? This is how Singapore government proceed on this ideas. So in 1968, this is I think one positive aspect is that Singapore government has sort of began to pay attention on the issue very early on, like in the early 1968. The government introduced ADF additional registration fee as a percentage of open market value, which is all the cars imported. Right? So open market value, basically the value of this car in the country where the car are manufactured, open market value, to bring down the increase in vehicle population. So what is the nature of additional registration fee? What is the nature? Well, the nature of additional registration fee is based on the additional charges, right? Additional charges. So in 1968, they say 15%. They find too low. People continue to buy more cars. Right? 72 changed to 25%, still too low. 75 changed to 100%, 1980, 150%, 175%, and so on and so forth. Basically, the government keep trying to figure out what is this right amount. Think about it, if you introduce this kind of policy in a lot of different countries here, you try to figure out the prices, you just basically try and error. You try to say, okay, what if I charge 50%? If it doesn't work, and get another 200%. Not necessarily a good idea, right? Politically, I think it's not a good idea, right? And also it could be undermine, the legitimacy of the government. They say, what you are doing? Or maybe they blame the government. The government only want to get more money from people. Okay, 15% not enough, you have to change 150%. Right? But the problem here, reflected here, is that government, for any action government want to take, what is the key problem with government imperfection? Is that they don't have information to figure out what to do. Right? That's inherent. Right? So you back and forth in doing this, politically not an attractive thing to do, and also that you may never get the right amount. And also they use other scheme called ALS. Right? So government introduced the scheme control usage vehicle. Individual vehicle owner must purchase a permit to drive into designated restricted zone. These are central business district, right? So you have to purchase this certain labels, right, in advance, so that you can actually, when you drive to those areas, then you display them, then you'll be all right. Otherwise, if you don't have those labels in advance purchased, then you will be fine, right? So use this kind of strategy, right? But the problem is that the higher cost of enforcement. Remember the high level of administrative cost involved. When you use something like that, right? How do you monitor it, enforce, implementation? Very costly. So here is the story. But you start with the market imperfection, and the solution seems to be quite simple. You use AEF, IOS, but the problem is that you're confronted with the several market imperfections here, right? Inadequate information. Lock-in and rigidity. Lock-in is that when government decided certain rates, people would expect that rates to continue for a while. It's not like you impose the income tax this year, and 6 months later you change income tax. People wouldn't. That's not politically a viable thing to do, right? Certain rigidity, right? In government policy, once it's introduced, like subsidy introduced, it's very difficult to take it back later. Even if you don't have the money anymore, there's certain rigidity there, right? And administrative costs involved, and the strategic responses from individuals. If you charge a lot of higher fee, what people will do? People will say, okay, if that's the case, I'm going to continue to use my old car. 10 years, 20 years, doesn't matter because it's not too expensive to buy it. But from the government perspective, do you want to see all these 20 years car on the road that easily kind of break down and all the cost additional pollution? You don't want that. Right? So that's kind of also strategic responses from the public in dealing with the government intervention. Right? So you got this problem you have to deal with at the same time. Right? And also we haven't really think about it. Our focus is thinking about how to deal with imperfection. But we haven't really thought about it, how you take advantage of the strengths of both. Okay, after 1990, several new instruments got introduced. So one is VQS, Vehicle Quota System. Right? This basically sets a quota to the number of new vehicles to be registered in Singapore each year. So every year they control the total number of the license plates that can be issued in Singapore in a particular year. Right? This kind of tricks. Right? That's a new step. Okay, think about the policy like this one. Who has the power to decide to use a policy like this one? Fix the number of cars. If you rely on market, the market never can precisely get that number, right? You can do whatever, you can try whatever. How can market get to that precise number? Well, government can do it. Government said each year this is the number of licenses we can offer. That's it. Right? So that's it. In a way, you can kind of think about this is something that the government can do, but the market can never really get it, right? Because of the coercive charge. So you've got and then electronic online auction system for allocating COE. Right? So once you decided the total number of license plates you can issue per year, then the next question is who's going to get it? Who can get it? Right? The first come, first serve rule? Or you form some committee to see who needed the badly? Or where in Singapore, basically, the use of auction. Basically, whoever can pay higher prices, then will get the license. This is using the auction system. So if you look at the auction system, this is basically take advantage of the benefits from the market. Basically, the market. If you set up a market like this one, the market will be able to pick up the fluctuation in the demand and supply automatically. Right? Government no longer needs to decide the additional payment. Right? Remember, additional payment, government tries to figure out 50%, 25%, 100%, never get it. But this time, government would never need to worry about that because it's all determined by the auction. Auction market will decide every month what is the prices, additional prices that will be charged. Right? So at the end of the day, people may complain about higher prices, but the government can always say this is determined by the market, not by us. So politically, this is actually can potentially turn it around. Right? There's also an electronic road pricing, which we'll also discuss later. And also government set a threshold speed, which we'll also discuss later. So if you look at what is the additional charge involved in owning a vehicle, a car in Singapore, right? This is the, first of all, this is the additional registration fee that's still continuing, right, to use that. Basically, this additional registration fee, basically look at the value of the vehicle. And if the value of the vehicle, the first Singapore dollar, 20,000, then this is 100%, right? And if the car is a very expensive car, then additional charge, 180% of the value, right? So that is already, if you think about expensive car, this could be also, that itself, RIF itself could be also already, more than 100% of the value already charged. In addition to this, in addition to AIF, there's a significant component called COE. This is the auction market. Auction market decide what are additional charges needed, right? So the auction is that you have every twice a month, right? This is, I think, last year. So the last year, if you look at it, these are cars with a different category. The car with a capacity of 6,000 cc and below, and the next one is about 16,000 cc, and the good vehicle, motorcycle, and the open cab. Right? So quarter is basically the number of license plates and we offer in that particular auction. Right? And also this is the price people need to pay. If you look at the 92,000, just for a small car, right? This is actually above and beyond the 100% AIF already charged. You have another $92,000 charge. And more important, that license plate that you got, when you paid $92,000 for the license plate, it only lasts for 10 years. It only lasts 10 years. After 10 years, if you still want to drive the vehicle that you own now, please get another license. It only lasts for 10 years. So this is actually, in a way, this auction market is determined by the market. So look at how the prices are determined. Can you get how the prices are determined in the auction market?
By bidding?
Yeah, in the bidding. How the prices get determined? Sorry? Demand, okay? Demand is basically a function of what? Of the economy, right? If the economy is doing very well, demand very high, right? And also depending on the supply of the quarter, how many quarters that you issue every month, right? Fewer the quarter, the higher the prices, right? Okay, but from your perspective, say how will government decide the quarter, the number of quarters? How does government decide how many the license plate to issue? Well, in this case, government basically look at the road construction, right? And also to see how many the license will expire. Remember, it's only 10 years, right? Will expire in a particular year, right? And then figure out what is the right amount of the quarter. This is a pure government decision, right? And then, determined by quarter, determined by macroeconomic conditions. So if you look at over the long period of time, really, the COE price really fluctuated a lot. So when I joined NUS in early 2000s, I joined NUS in 2001. At that time, about $30,000 the CEO, right? And if you look at in this 2009, the lowest prices actually $2. You just pay $2 and you get a car, right? No, I'm talking about COE, only $2. What happened in 2009? Why in 2009 it was only $2 to get it? Crisis, economic crisis, right? Economic crisis, and at that time everyone was worried about their job. Very few people want to buy a car at the time. As a matter of fact, I never thought about buying a car in Singapore because it was so expensive. But when I see that $2, I think then it's time. I actually bought my car the next month. So my COE is only $2,000 compared to last year's $92,000. Well, it's a fluctuation. It's a depend on the demand and supply, right? That the market capture these fluctuations. Now think about it, a government agency, Ministry of Transport, try to figure out what is the right amount of CO2 to charge in a particular month. Can we do that? They'll never be able to do that, right? And people always will complain, why this month is higher, that next month is lower, why the following months become higher again? Forever you have this complaint, but if you leave to the market figure out, right? Okay. Now, if you look at car ownership in Singapore, right, because of this, Singapore, if you look at the GNI adjusted by PDP, is quite high, close to $60,000. Much higher than South Korea and Malaysia. It's also higher than other developed countries. But if you look at passenger car per 1,000 people, Singapore is about 100 out of 1,000 people. United States, 1,000 people, on average got 461 cars. And for South Korea and Malaysia, this is more than double the car ownership in Singapore. Well, the reason is that earlier I showed you the real time, right? The real time traffic condition in Singapore. Well, part of the reason that you can figure out is why? Because the fewer number of cars in general, if you look at this level of car ownership, it just means fewer level of car ownership, right? So, the other issues with the traffic congestion is oftentimes not necessarily because of the number of cars, but the car appears in the wrong time, in the wrong places. Right? That's oftentimes a problem. So it doesn't matter if you have a car and you leave the car at home, and you take the public transport, then you wouldn't have an impact on the traffic congestion. Right? But the problem is that or if you drive during 11 o'clock in the evening, and there's no problem at all. But the car tends to appear in the wrong time, the wrong place. Then how do you deal with that? Well, basically here again the combination of the government the government intervention as well as the market mechanism. In this instance, is the use of electronic road pricing. Remember, in the early days, the way they try to figure out is basically to issue this label. Right? You have to buy this label before you get into it, right? And then highly, administrative costs and so forth, right? Now, because of the advancing technologies, they're able to introduce a system electronically can charge. Right? So basically, in each car you will install these devices, and when car pass those gateways, then the money automatically gets deducted from that account. Now, so, and then you can see that this tells you a particular time, the ERP, how much charge it for private car, $2, you pass that for that, right? For the trucks, $3, and so forth. So this is basically the electronic the road pricing system. So this is to control the issue that the car show up in the wrong time and wrong places, right? And this is a map of the ERP system in Singapore. So the various places where you get to where charges will be levied. Right? Okay, if you were to design the system, now the next question is, how do you figure out the price to charge? This is another issue. In general, again, based on economists, solution is quite easy. Let's charge additional cost. Easy. But here, should I charge $2, $2.50, $3, $4? How much should I charge? Right? I mean, that's a practical question. In the public policy, we don't just look at the direction changes. We have to look at precisely what you do. The government can implement. So how do you decide that, right? Now, if you look at those ERP charges here, the ERP charge, this is a different point where the fee will be levied here, right? So you look at the 7,
to 705. This is 50 cents. What happened before 7? What happened before 7?
Free?
No charge, free. Why is it free?
No traffic?
Because no additional cost. There's no cost associated with congestion, right? It's the road is very smooth. If it's very smooth, it means my action does not impose additional cost on others. If that's the case, there's no need to charge, right? And then you gradually you see that 735 to 750. That's the highest reduction, 250. Why? Well, that's a rush hour. A lot of people would like to, drive their car to a certain location, and they have to pass allocation. A lot of cost, a lot of demand. Well, if a lot of demand, well, the prices get higher. So you can see that these are kind of sort of different charges. And the different charges actually also, government basically have a policy about how to make those changes. So the government decides that what is the optimal speed in a different road. Like the optimal speed in arterial road is between 20 kilometers per hour to 30 kilometers per hour, right? And then expressway is between 45 to 65. Okay. So if you find out, if you charge a certain ERP rate, if you charge a certain rate, you find that in these roads, you tend to find that the overall speed is less than 20. Less than 20 mean what? What does that mean when the speed is less than 20? Traffic congestion began to build, right? And this is the time you increase ERP, right? And this is, if the speed, right, is more than 30, what does that mean? It means there's no need to charge it. So whenever there's a certain like this, the Department of Transport will basically lower the ERP, right? Because you can actually lower the ERP because your action will not cost additional cost on others, right? So the same thing for expressway, right? So basically, government just need to decide what is the optimal range that they work with, right? If the below and above optimal range, you make adjustment to the rates, right? So basically, this is the use of both the market mechanism, right, as well as the government intervention. The government decides the optimal range and then leave the market to decide what is the charges should be. But of course, government will still suffer from the issue of information. In this particular cases, if you look at 2008, the net increase allowed 3% of the vehicle population. This is to decide how many porters how many license plates to issue. Right? In 2008, is 3%. Then by 2010, they realized we probably issued too many licenses because we observed more congestions. Right? So they adjust to 1.5%. Then August of 2012, it's further sort of reduced to 1%. And then today is basically only 5%. Okay, so the government is still trying to figure out, right? Because what is the optimal number of the vehicle, the license plate they will issue. But this is actually, but look at this kind of decisions, right? Politically, if you compare this decision with the decision to directly decide on the prices, which one is politically will attract less attention? This one, right? This one that you still have a bit more room to operate because it's not will have a significant attention. The public focusing on general pricing here. Here that you do not have information, you still can make a refinement. Here it is. So basically here is that there are multiple areas of the government can intervene. But you can actually look at to what extent that those different mechanisms actually will induce the level of government intervention, and actually try to find the right tool, right, or the right area to focus. Okay, then you may wonder, in this storage, you charge 100% of open market value. On top of that, you charge 92,000 for 10 years. Who's get left out? Who got left out in this picture here? It's effective in terms of reducing the traffic congestion, but who got left out? The poor, right? The poor, if you don't have the money, if you actually need the car, well, you got a problem. Right? So you got all these. We're not just looking at efficiency, right? You're gonna have to also looking at the equity issue, right? So eventually, that you got all these market mechanisms work very well in promoting efficiency, that reduce traffic congestion. But what about the goals other than efficiency? Who's going to take care of it? Government, right? So here, if you look at the issue here, rapid development of public transport is a part of the government strategy. So for Singapore, once you achieve a level with a very low car ownership, then most of the people have no choice but take public transport. This is actually very good news for the development of public transport because you have ridership. You have guaranteed ridership that allow you to expand, improve services, and so on. So this is actually, in a way, it's good news. But also, if you look at the various government sort of regulation here, right? So, for example, this one, HDB, 80% of Singaporeans live in HDB, housing development board unit, right? So 80% of the Singaporeans stay there. And if you look at the poor can also, middle income can live in HDB. The government says HDB town must have MRT, right? And the bus services that directly connect to the city center. You have the bus line that directly bring to different estate where majority of people live, including the poor, to the city center. That's kind of one. The other is the road must be direct no more than 30% longer distances than comparable trip by car. Because sometimes you don't have a passengers. If you take bus, you tend to do a lot of detour, right? You have to go to a lot of long distance to get somewhere else because there's enough passengers there, right? For more direction. But here, the regulation says it cannot be 30% longer. Well, that's actually ensure that if you take buses, right, actually the time you go get from place to place is actually not too long compared to the right. These are something also only government can sort of adopt, right? Policy government can adopt. So this is the overall. This is basically the policy innovation or the system of policy mix in places to deal with problems. So we've got a marketing profession, we've got a government profession, they exist at the same time, right? Because they exist at the same time, the policy innovation must take the form of the policy mix here. Involve, we discussed earlier, right? The auction system, which is focusing on the advantages of the market, right? And focusing on the problem of the inadequate information for the government, right? And the ERP, and also vehicle quota system. This is action by the government. This is something market cannot do, right? And the low threshold speed. This is the government decided to impose that. Rapid development of public transport system is also public government intervention. And those interventions take advantage of the government strengths, and those set of the strategy take advantage of the market strengths. Right? So the policy mix here make sure that you can deal with both the government imperfection, market perfection at the same time. You can take advantage of both. So that's one area in the land transport. So again, I think I want to discuss this framework where this framework can apply not only land transport area. This framework can apply to other policy sectors. which we have both imperfections that work. Okay, now let's shift to the healthcare. This is a typical path of policy reform in many countries, including developing countries, developed countries, in dealing with healthcare problems. Oftentimes we start with healthcare as the main responsibility of the government. Healthcare concerning life and death situation, people argue that this is something that government needs to play a major role, right? So if you look at many countries, typically it started with a health system with public financing and public provision. I think this is probably the I think that the former Soviet Union, much of you have a government-owned hospital, and also you look at the financing of healthcare is very much from the public as well, right? And if you look at other countries, right, in the world, many countries in the world today still dominated by this public financing and public provision system of healthcare. Why? Because of the importance of healthcare as the essential social good. But the problem is that if you have this system dominated by the private sector, by the government, there are going to be suffer from a range of the government imperfection. Right? That imperfection manifested in the healthcare sectors, right, are the following, right? Inefficiency in government-owned health facilities. In India, in many places, people don't want to visit the public-owned hospital because the level of service available is very small. Right? Regulatory capture is another issue. Government ought to regulate the provider, but the regulators actually oftentimes work with the party being regulated because it potentially benefit both of them at the cost of the patient and the public. Right? Buffet syndrome. What is the buffet syndrome? Is that if your health care is completely covered by insurance, then whenever you have a little bit of a feel, not good and so forth, the first thing you go to the biggest hospital. But then I remember that's my behavior too. When I have this insurance card which allow me to go to the emergencies, with very low cost, I always go to emergencies. Because you go to big hospital emergency, you can take care of it right away. If you go to other places, you may wait 1 hour before someone can attend you. Right? So those, and also, if someone cover your health care, then if they give you the choice of the hospital where to stay, you want to stay 1 room, right? You don't want to share the hospital bed with 8 others, right? So you have the but whether or not there are significant benefit you got from doing that, whether or not that you got significant benefit by staying that compared to others, but from the perspective of managed services, there really perhaps not significant difference, right? But if the health care is covered by someone else, not from your own pocket, then you can tend to want to get higher level of service and more services. Right, that's actually natural. Inadequate information is oftentimes information asymmetry. Doctors know much more about the healthcare system and various of treatment more than the patient. That's an information asymmetry. And financial sustainability. Do we have enough money to continue public provision and public finance? In many countries, the reason that the reform gets started is because government benefits. Because of rising healthcare costs. The government has no choice but to let the private sector pay for it. So that's a problem here. Okay. Now you've got all these problems here. Then last 20 years, in many different countries, the policy reform in healthcare has been dominated by market-oriented reform, right? Imposing higher user charges, right? Privatized hospital, contract out, various of the so-called new public management mechanisms are used in healthcare. But are they working? Well, if you look at the result, the market imperfection, they're inherent. If you start to use those market mechanisms you have to look at this set of market imperfection. Lots of economic efficiency due to market theories. Market power. You want the hospital to compete. Can they really compete? You've got two hospitals provide service. I'm not sure that we can really reach a high level of competition with the hospital. That can actually pursue crucial goals. So we've got a lot of power. And this is I'm not going to get into details of the story in the healthcare of Singapore, right? I just wanted to kind of present to you, this is the same the same phenomenon or the same strategy here. It's basically got this policy mix here, right? You got public ownership of the majority of the hospital, Medishield, this insurance scheme, Medifund, government subsidy to hospital care, transparency of the hospitals, these are kind of focused on the government strengths. And these set of the policy choices really focusing on the use of market mechanisms, right? Medicine, freedom to choose hospital bed class, market competition for outpatient care. So these are a set of the market-based mechanisms. And you observe that they exist at the same time. You may wonder why these kind of strategies actually look so very contradicting each other, but they coexist. And they coexist, they can coexist effectively to deal with the problem of both market imperfection and the government imperfection. Right. Okay, to conclude, policy mix. Right? Policy mix is that typically we find out effective policy solution is not the use of a single instrument. They involve mix of different instruments. Right? The different instruments might actually be contradicting to each other. So that policy mix is a form of policy innovation may become a normal responses, not a single option. The policy innovation may appear as a combination of set of seemingly unrelated or even contradicting policy instruments. Adequacy of policy mix depend on the effectiveness to address both imperfections. Third, the efficacy of a potential policy instrument in consideration should be assessed in the context of strength and weakness of existing policy mix. Sometimes when we are very excited about a particular instrument, we tend to forget what's the policy mix, existing policy mix that are already there. To what extent that new instrument introduced can complement it, or can potentially to fix the problem, or maybe to worsen the situation. Yeah. So basically this is basically, when we're looking at the use of a particular instrument, new instrument, we should assess it based on the existing set of policy mix. And then another option, another lesson, this is a lesson for policy design. For policy design, the concept of policy option can be broadened to compare not only different instruments, but the different combination of the instruments. In other words, you're not looking at the taxes versus regulation versus something else. You are looking at a combination of a set of instruments as option, compared with another combination, another set of choices as an option, compared with the next one. And the optimal policy mix may evolve over time due to changing factors determining market. So this is basically saying that at any given time, you may believe that you've reached this optimal mix, but that optimal mix may not last very long because it's changing external environment. That actually the optimal mix will actually evolve over time when external conditions change. Right? These are kind of future research questions for people here who are interested in doing some works and related to policy sector you are interested, or what particular country context that you're interested in. I think these are kind of questions that can be studied further. One is what kind of institutional arrangement might be more conducive to the development of optimal mix of policy innovation. Why do we see policy innovation in some places but not in others? In some sectors but not in others? What are the institutional environment explain the absences, the appearances or dominance of the use of policy innovation. Are there any mechanisms to help to generate optimal policy mix of policy innovation in circumstances that are not conducive? The question when I lecture those policy innovation in Singapore, the typical question is, oh, you're talking about Singapore. I heard that everything seems to work there. What about China and India, where the external environment is not conducive? What can we do about that? I mean, that doesn't seem to be hopeful. I mean, so that's kind of interesting to say. Well, any mechanism. When you have an unfavorable environment, how can you do that? Or can you do that? When external conditions are unfavorable. The last is with more widespread use of policy mix have an impact on shaping the institutional environment and in which policy decisions are made. So basically, look at other way around. Here we blame the environment. But here, well, maybe we just start from policy design to say, well, why use of these policy mix can have a positive impact on the environment we operate. Well, whether or not that this can be true or this is just wishful thinking. Okay, I'll stop my presentation here just to leave some time for Q&A.
Well, thank you for your fascinating presentation. I have two questions. Well, first, I'm wondering how much of a resentment was there in Singapore against the very restrictive car policies? Because, for example, in this country, a few years ago, the government tried actually to ban cars having a steering wheel on the right side. Basically, well, I mean, they were imported from Japan, they were used, a lot of them were, they were cheap, they were pretty cheap, so a lot of people were buying them. So the government actually tried to do that, to ban them, saying that they don't comply with security standards and so. Basically, there was a big resentment. People started to protest, and the government had to back out. The violence or compromise. So even in a very restrictive situation framework, environment, you had resentment. So the government actually had to back out. They did not have enough resources to enforce that. And if you do something like that in European, American context, I imagine the government would need to resign the next day because you end up with massive strikes all over the place. And then the second question is more theoretic. With this government market paradigm and more market tools being used by the government, would you say we are seeing some sort of a change in the role of the state? So, for example, in certain European countries, the government basically outsourced the customs service to a private security company. So a private security company runs customs for the government. In some places they outsource, they hire security companies to do police functions in certain neighborhoods. So would you say we're seeing some sort of a change, this marketization of the government from a more Weberian concept of the state as a political institution to some sort of a more supplier of services? So, and will we reach a point where we will see, a private police or a private military or something like that? What the trend is?
Yeah, I think resentment definitely. I think that in Singapore, I think when the policies introduced in the 70s, 80s, there's always a group of people who would like to buy a car and feel that their chances much diminished because of these policies. But I think I got a couple of thoughts on that. One is that can government be sure that these policies are technically sound to stop this? In other words, the resentment and so forth. Whether or not, if you implement that policy, is it really a good policy? Right? Technically sound, right? Because here, you can't just say that if it's implemented, it definitely can be positive. Sometimes that because of resentment, that these policies are not implemented, which can be a good thing. If these policies are not technically sound, to stop it, right? So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind, not necessarily to implement to implement that policy is actually be worse than having the political opposition here. Right? The other, of course, this is actually highly depending on the country circumstances. Also depending on the circumstances of the political environment in a certain country. For example, in the policies that implemented in Singapore in 70, 80, 90, probably will be challenged more in today's environment, where the election can become more contested. In the early days, I think in the 80 and 90, because Singapore government has been able to implement a range of policies that help to significantly improve the well-being of the public. So the government has certain legitimacy, right? Because they can say to people, okay, you may not like a particular policy that I adopted, but see what I have done in the past. I've been able to put it out to improve your well-being. So to bear with us, for a year, 2 years, I will show you that these policies will work. And at the end of the day, if you look at the resentment and so forth, if you really to provide choices for the public in Singapore, do they think that they are going to vote for the situation as in Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi? Or they would say, okay, your current system actually work quite well, and actually it doesn't matter whether you use public transport or it doesn't take you very long time or waste a lot of time from point A to point B. So I think that's that political context is very important here. And the other thing about what is the use of market mechanism? I think my story today is basically saying that do not be overly enthusiastic about any particular policy direction. When you look at the market mechanism, there's a lot of enthusiasm. And that I actually wrote an article focused on healthcare. And my observation is that these optimism are so pervasive. There's a certain proposition that really never really got tested, but people just believing in them, as religiously believing, these things. Just you don't question it because private sector bring more efficiency. That's no question. If we do not see the efficiency gain, it's ourselves. We have a problem of implementing. It's not because of the market force. But here, my story here is that market mechanism will incur some inherent shortcomings. Inherent shortcomings. It doesn't matter if you are in different stages of development in the market. And if you do not deal with that inherent shortcoming, sooner or later, there's a pushback. 5 years, 10 years later, people are going to say these market reform in general have failed. This is actually, if you look at 5 years ago in China, this is a main statement about healthcare reform in the past 20 years. Basically, the statement is that the past 10, 15 years, healthcare reform has generally failed. And then basically, much emphasis now has become to put the government back in, emphasize more government intervention. But of course, if you're overly excited about that, then maybe 10 years later, you will another pushback. So this is that. I think the general idea is that it's not too excited about a particular direction. You have to go looking at the duality, which is imperfection. They are a fact. They are inherent. You have to deal with it. If you don't deal with it, they can cause harm.
It seems to me that the public-private partnership mechanism is a good way to use these kind of examples that you showed because of this imperfections in both systems. Is there any other mechanisms Singapore is being used beyond PPP?
Yeah, I think PPP definitely I think a worthy option to pursue, right? But PPP is that you have also have a look at the implementation detail of the PPP. If it works well, it takes advantage of the both. But if it doesn't work well, it amplifies the
shortcut approach. In other words, the PPP that you go and use, sometimes you use PPP, right? Not only you continue to have the problems of the inefficiency of public sector, you continue to have that, but at the same time, that PPP arrangement have a significant increase in prices, and basically incurring significant resistance from the public, right? And also because the private sector involved, that really restrict your the kind of venues to pursue the goal other than efficient, right? So maybe sometimes the PPP doesn't work well. You actually can see the kind of worsening situation of both market and the government. So I think again, in overall, for any kind of instrument we look at, we have to bear in mind that what are the potential shortcomings, inherent imperfection when you use it. But of course, these are all in development. There are new forms of perhaps PPP will improve, and when people learn to be smarter, when more evidence become available, and then perhaps a new form can help to address those shortcomings more effectively. But in general, I cannot say that PPP offers a superior mechanism compared to what exists today. The PPP can certainly, in many places that I've studied, can certainly make some worse.
Any other questions? No?
Okay.
Professor Chung, thank you very much for this very thought-provoking presentation.